Hello again. Welcome back to those who are returning, and welcome to those who are joining us today. Just to recap, we've been looking at some of the flashpoints in the United States, in the history of the United States, and the history of Jews in the United States, and the ways in which Jews coped with times of crisis. And we looked, for example, at some of the wars, beginning with the Civil War, and we went on to the First World War, and we looked at how sometimes these crises involved Jews in specific ways, even though, of course, Jews were always a very small minority in the American nation. But Jews were affected by every crisis that affected the rest of the United States, and sometimes even there were specific Jewish angles or dimensions that we could identify. And what we're going to do today is to carry on looking at some of these crises or difficult periods, less about wars, and today we're concentrating more on domestic issues that evolved with the American polity and the American economy. And the first issue that we're going to look at has to do with the turmoil surrounding labor relations in the United States. And the reason why this is an issue that also affected Jews, well, as we'll see as we go along, Jews were both workers, employees, and Jews were also business owners, entrepreneurs. And whatever affected struggle and turmoil in the lives of workers affected Jews as such. Secondly, the great leap forward of the United States from what had been an agrarian nation in the early 19th century. Once we get past the Civil War, the United States is starting to make its great leap as a major manufacturing power in the world economy. And one of the key factors that made that great leap forward possible for the American industrial economy was, of course, the arrival of millions of immigrant workers. And Jews were about 1 in 7 of those arriving immigrants. And therefore, whatever involves workers and manufacturing and factory labor is also going to affect Jews. In some cities, working class Jews who worked in manual trades of one kind or another were about 1/3 of the Jewish population. In New York City, however, where half of the Jews of the United States came to live at that time, in New York, about 60% or more of the Jews who were at all employed, leaving out children and the unemployed, about 60% of Jews employed in the labor market in one way or another were in fact manual workers. And so this is an issue that mattered to very, very many Jewish people along with their neighbors. And there are several interesting angles when we look at the world of labor history and how it turned into a struggle for workers' rights. There are several interesting angles. One of them, of course, is the struggle for representation, for unionization, for the right to collective bargaining with employers. None of these rights were recognized under American law at the time. American law in the 19th century to the early 20th century still more or less held that the right to property was sacred, and what a person did with their property, including how many people, under what conditions, At what salary did they employ such people on their property? And the only right that a worker was supposedly given was the right to accept the offered pay or to leave. Those were the only rights. And so the entire development of the idea that working people were people, and they also had rights, not simply as those who served the interest of the private enterprise in which they were employed. This was a struggle, and it went through the courts, and it went through public opinion, and it went through important public events, strikes and demonstrations, and so on. Eventually, it also involved the rise of political parties and political movements of the left, including the Socialist Party. Now, I said that Jews were involved in all of this because they were workers and because they were immigrants. And we'll get back to the employers in a moment. But one of the important things to understand is that employers, especially at large factories, tried to use the fact that their workforce, their labor force, was split among different ethnic and racial groups. Sometimes they employed black people in their labor force in order to prevent the blacks and the whites in their employ from trying to get together. The same thing with Catholics, the same thing with other ethnic definitions. Immigrants, fresh off the boat, very often were recruited as scab labor to break strikes. And so the question of would workers who came from different cultures and spoke different languages and belonged, belonged to different religious and cultural groups, would they cooperate across these social boundaries in order to create some sort of worker solidarity vis-a-vis the bosses, vis-a-vis their employers? This was a major issue. And the Jews, along with others in the labor force, were heavily invested, number one, in mobilizing their fellow workers and also stressing the idea of solidarity among workers across ethnic, linguistic, and religious and racial divisions. And sometimes it worked better and sometimes less. But the point is that all of this was going on. It involved Jews intimately and very intensely. I said also, of course, that Jews who had been veteran Americans, they had arrived in America earlier and had started to make their way up the socioeconomic ladder. Some of them were, in fact, among the ranks of the employers. In fact, some of the biggest employers, especially in the garment industry, were Jewish firms. And this introduced yet another Jewish element into this entire story of unionization and labor relations, because the idea that Jews, as Jews, could have opposing interests, this was something that needed to be dealt with at the community level. It wasn't the first time, obviously, and in previous sessions, when we looked, for example, at the American Civil War, we saw there were Jews in the North and Jews in the South. Jews in the North tended to support the Union, and their sons fought in the Union Army, and consequently, the same thing was true in the South, and Jews were fighting Jews as other Americans were fighting other Americans. So the idea that crisis can split the Jewish community into opposing camps, this is not something new. Division and dissent within the Jewish community, perception of opposing interests within the Jewish public, this is not something new. On the other hand, as we also saw, And as I'll stress going forward, these crisis periods or these problems, these issues of controversy and struggle, they also tended to become opportunities for people involved in these issues to create new organizations, to develop effective leadership in order to start coping with these issues. And one of the important things to remember about these hard times, these times of crisis, is that they were difficult, but they were also opportunities. And the way in which these opportunities were used did tend to wax and wane in terms of how effective Jews could be in the public square. Last time when we spoke for a few minutes about the campaign in 1911 to abrogate the commercial treaty between the United States and Russia, because Russia, as a despotic empire that was oppressing its people, including the Jews, why should Russia continue to be a valued and favored trading nation with a commercial treaty with the United States? This was the campaign. And it allowed Jews not only to face the American public with an issue that was Jewish but also American at the same time, to deal with Congress and the ways in which effective leaders came to the fore in order to wage that campaign, which was ultimately successful. This is one of the lessons that I think we should try to get out of these case studies of Jews in times of crisis. And the same thing was going to happen when we look, as we do today, at the Jews on the left, the Jews in the labor movement, and so on. The labor movement as such in the United States has roots going back well into the early years of the nation, but the real development of labor organizations dates from the middle and second half of the 19th century. And the early labor organizations tended to involve craft workers, very highly skilled workers, who were banding together to protect the standard of pay in their industry, to control entry of working people into their craft, and to keep their wages high. In other words, we could even call it a kind of upper level or even middle class type of labor organizing. When we get into the period that interests us in particular, that is, when masses of Jews, along with other European immigrants, poured into America's growing cities and growing industries, we're talking about a different phenomenon entirely. Not small craft unions that were there to protect high wages, but massive organizations across craft lines of an entire industry, garment workers, who each group of them worked at different parts of the process of the manufacturing, and some of them worked in factories, and some of them worked at home, taking piecework home to do at home, and we're talking about 14, 15, 16-hour work days at less than any reasonable amount of pay, the massive employment of children. In the photo that you see on the screen, some of the young people there are holding, wearing signs, banners, in Yiddish and in English, asking to abolish child slavery. Nieder mit der Sklaverei. And this is not black slavery they're talking about wage slavery. in the factories of the late 19th century, early 20th century. One of the memorable occasions in this history of Jews and labor relations and the struggle for workers' rights was the famous uprising of the 20,000, as it was called, a massive strike across the garment industry as a whole, called in New York in 1909. It involved 20,000 and more workers, not only in New York, but elsewhere. This was one of the high points of the development of unionization and the mobilization of labor leaders for the sake of worker representation and collective bargaining. As it happened, and I'll again reiterate that some of the biggest employers in the industry also happened to be Jews, and the mediator who was called in this case of the uprising of the 20,000, was an attorney by the name of Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis came in as a mediator to try and bring about some sort of a peaceful resolution of the struggle between the employers and these mass of strikers. The agreement that was finally reached was meant to last for years. It was called the Protocol of Peace, meant to establish a new framework of working relations in which workers' rights would be recognized, working conditions and wages would be greatly improved, and so on. Louis Brandeis, of course, was on his way to becoming one of the important political figures in the Jewish leadership of the day. He would later become the leader of the Zionist organization in the United States, and then was appointed as a justice of the Supreme Court. The other indicators that progress and strengthening was happening on the front of the labor struggle and the mobilization of workers' issues in the political sphere was the rise, as I mentioned earlier, of the Socialist Party. The United States, as is well known, is not terribly friendly to third parties or fourth or fifth, but sometimes it does happen. And two of the early successes, electorally speaking, of the Socialist Party occurred in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with the election of Victor Berger to Congress, and in New York with the election of Meyer London to Congress. He was elected twice, in 1914 and 1916. London, himself a Jewish immigrant, representing a district full of Jewish immigrant workers in downtown New York. It wasn't just about wages, and it wasn't just about successes. These struggles also entailed terrible tragedies, such as the tragic event that took place in March of 1911 at a factory known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of a high-rise building downtown in New York on the eastern side of Washington Square. Fire broke out in the factory. 143 women and 23 men died in that fire. Some plummeted to their death by trying to escape from the building. The lowest age among the workers was 14, and the oldest among the workers were aged 23. This is a mass tragedy. It involved mostly Italian and Jewish women, some of them teenagers. The tragedy led to massive outcry in the public and eventually to new legislation in the New York State legislature and elsewhere to create new standards for safety in places of work. The funerals of these young people were public events that involved the entire community. And all of these labor-related struggles were, in fact, not just about the workers themselves. It was about their families. It was about their communities. Every major strike involved not just the workers striking, but again, their entire communities. And so this way of life of Jews involved in the labor market as working people, this entire way of life is something that had a great influence on the shaping not only of Jewish public life, but also of the ways in which Jews saw themselves becoming Americans on a certain side of the political camp that was pushing for reform, democratization, rights for more people, and so forth. These causes led Jews, as others, to look for coalitions with like-minded people across the ethnic and religious divides of the time. This sort of coalition building took place, for example, in the successful election of Al Smith for New York governor. Later, Smith ran unsuccessfully for U.S. president, but he had a great deal of backing in the Jewish electorate. One of Smith's key advisors was a woman named Belle Moskowitz, who had come out of the labor movement and was his advisor on labor and economic relations, and pioneered in New York State while he was governor some of the social welfare and labor reform issues that we associate with the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but some of these were pioneered even earlier, as I say, partly involving Jews and non-Jews in these large, across-the-board, left and liberal coalitions. The photo on the left is Lillian Wald, a prominent figure in New York. She founded and led the Henry Street Settlement House. Settlement houses were essentially offices, buildings located within tenement slums in the major cities. They dispensed social relief and welfare programs, projects for new mothers, for women, for workers, classes after work, also every type of activity or assistance that could help people improve their lives. On this slide also I'm giving you a preview of the 1930s. In 1936, two of the most important labor leaders in the United States, both of them Jewish, Sidney Hillman of Chicago and David Dubinsky of New York, both of them in the garment unions, they founded the American Labor Party. The American Labor Party, which existed mainly in New York State, was an alternative ticket for people who wanted to vote as progressives, and yet they also wanted to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, who was also the Democratic Party candidate. They didn't want to vote for him on the Democratic ticket. The Democratic Party, obviously, was a capitalist party, but voting for Roosevelt as the nominee of the ALP was kosher. So this worked out very well for Roosevelt and for the ALP and for the Jewish voters. In the scene that you see, one of the electoral campaign offices, this is a poster or a photo that highlighted the fact that women voters who had only gotten the right to vote 15 years before were being encouraged to learn to vote, to come out and do their civic duty. Lernen sich wie zu stimmen. Learn how to vote. While all of this is going on, the other major source of turmoil and indeed crisis that had an effect not only on the United States at large, but on the Jews in particular, was the fact that in the 1920s, the United States Congress voted to curtail immigration from Europe. Previously, immigration from Asia had been restricted, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but by the 1910s, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment was becoming part of public discourse in the United States, even as the Jewish community at large was successful in 1911, as we saw, in pressuring the Russian government abroad into treating the Jews better by working through Washington and the abrogation of the commercial treaty. At the same time, the same Jewish community and its leadership proved unsuccessful in the other major challenge of the day, namely to keep the gates of immigration open. It didn't happen right away. In 1911, a congressional commission was set up to look into the entire immigrant and immigration question, and this was called the Dillingham Commission, after one of the congressional leaders of the commission, and it produced an 11-volume report. During World War I, all of this was suspended. No immigration to speak of actually reached the United States during World War I, but immediately after the war ended in 1919, another massive wave of immigrants began to enter the United States, including a backlog of people who had been waiting to rejoin their families, some members, men and women who had already reached the United States before 1914 and were stuck in Europe for the interim. In 1921, on the crest of this massive wave of new immigration, as well as in the wake of what was called the Red Scare in 1920 and 21, the search for subversives and anarchists suspected of wishing to overthrow the system of government in the United States, and there were in fact bombs planted at the homes of prominent American political figures. This combined with deportations of suspected radicals and anarchists. By the time we get to 1920 and 21, this becomes the what we might call the last straw in the eyes of the immigration restrictionists. And the year 1921 saw the passage of the National Origins Quota Act, which was going to restrict any further immigration to the United States to a certain percentage. At first it was 3% of any national group already residing in the United States, shall we say, Germans, Slovaks, Poles, Italians, and so forth. And in 1924, these quotas were further restricted by lowering the percentage to 2% and also by rolling back into the late 19th century the year at which these percentages were going to be based. So that if, for example, there were 250,000 Jews living in the United States in 1881, the benchmark would have been set at that time. There was no Jewish quota. I should make that clear. There was never any Jewish quota. However, it was sufficient for the Congress to weight the national origins quotas heavily against anyone coming from Eastern Europe or Southern Europe. That is to say, Catholics, Jews, Greek and Russian Orthodox, anyone who was not Northern European or Protestant, They were the ones who received the smallest immigration quotas, and therefore it was not necessary to include a Jewish quota. It was enough to include a Polish quota. Anyone coming from Poland necessarily also included those many, many Jews who had originally been living in Poland. Why were the quotas weighted in that fashion against Southern and Eastern Europeans? Well, here I remind you, as we said in one of our previous sessions, after the Civil War, the freeing of the slaves did not end the race question in the United States. Far from it. In some ways, the emancipation of the slaves in the United States only augmented the question of the various races, because all of the people living in the United States were now, under law at least, on paper, considered to be equal citizens. And of course we know that was never the case. Equality wasn't happening, and the distinctions that were going to be made on the basis of race. And race, of course, was used in a far more radical way than we use the term today. Southern Italians were a race. Jews were a race. Race was used in some ways that we would today refer to an ethnic group or a cultural group, but race was the term that was used then. And the entire quota system that was instituted to restrict immigration in 1921 and 1924, the entire system was in fact intended to preserve, and I use scare quotes for all of this, to preserve the racial integrity of the American nation against the invasion, so-called, of lesser races. And it's no accident that these immigration quotas weighted heavily against Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, Italians and Greeks and Jews and Slovaks and Poles. It's no accident that these immigrant quotas were enacted at the same time as quotas were being enacted against Jews in America's elite universities. In other words, we're dealing with a large dose of anti-Semitism invading the public sphere in American life. It wasn't just quotas. The quotas are important for us to remember because it meant that anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish feeling were becoming institutionalized. But that was, as we might say, not even the cutting edge of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States. The more extreme manifestations, if we can call it that, the most extreme manifestations of anti-Jewish sentiment were in other forms, not necessarily institutionalized, not in immigrant quotas and not in university systems. Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company fame, in the newspaper he owned, the Dearborn Independent in Michigan, published in serial form articles called The International Jew, which were a version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that famous forgery that claimed that Jews all over were engaged in a conspiracy to dominate the world and dominate political life and the economy and everything else. Ford was a rabid anti-Semite. In the 1930s, he got very close with the Nazi leadership in Germany. But he wasn't the only one. There was a movement known as the Silver Shirts. They were fascists in the United States, led by a man named William Paley. They also had their press known as Liberation. As you see, one of the front pages shown in this screen is from his newspaper, German Jews Get What They Asked For. This is a page from 1938 in which Paley and his people were basically saying, well, the Jews simply deserve to be persecuted because they are such hateful people. This is what was going on the anti-Semitic front in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. And the question is, what did the Jews do about it? Well, first of all, they did hold major rallies here. On the one hand, the Nazi flag being paraded in an American city in the 1930s, and on the other hand, the headline, the front page from the Daily News that you see on the right, a massive 40,000 rally against Nazism at Madison Square Garden. These were the events involving Jews trying to cope with the crisis of the 1930s that was made at the time. Rallying public opinion was only one of the aspects of this Jewish response. Another aspect was the campaign to boycott German goods in the United States. It won a fair amount of support in American public life. The famous example would be the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, used his authority as mayor to block German goods from being unloaded at docks in the port of New York. But Jews also responded politically by simply voting in massive, over 90% turnouts for the person whom they thought they could trust to mount a real struggle against Nazism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who received ever-increasing shares of the Jewish vote from his first election in 1932 to his second in 36 and his third in 40 and so forth, while his support across the nation slipped from election to election among the Jews, the support only rose. Because Roosevelt was the one American political leader who stood against American isolationism, who stood in favor of American interventionism in European affairs. He was the one whom the Jews felt could be most trusted. And how this played out, we'll see next time. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again in our next session.